Hello, I'm Iona from the Local Energy Scotland team. Local Energy Scotland delivers the Scottish Government's Community and Renewable Energy Scheme, CARES. And through CARES, we've been able to put this session together for you. I'll hand you over to David from Locogen, who's going to present about Gate 2 and provide key information to help us all understand what needs to be thought about and anything that needs to be done to make sure projects don't lose their grid connection. And then we'll have a session at the end with some questions that we can take, and I'll keep an eye on the chat for anything that comes in. Thank you. David, over to you.
Thank you very much, both. Right, so we're here to talk about the Grid queue Gate 2 process, which is something that has been talked about a huge amount over the last sort of few months, and has, by the nature of the changes that have been made, meant that there's a huge amount of information that's been put out. Some of it to do with actual policy that's been released or specific code changes or guidance that have come out, and some things that are consultations. And it has been, for those of us that spend our time sort of literally staring at this and not a lot else, it's confusing. And I can understand how this is something that that if you have a single project is quite potentially quite onerous. So what I'm going to try and do is go through some of the stages of how we've got to this and what this current step in the process means and what we have to do with each of the projects to ensure that you can make the best decisions for your project to retain your grid connections, or even some circumstances potentially even advance them. I'm expecting the sort of presentation-y bits of this to last sort of 30-40 minutes, and then hopefully there should be enough time at the end for slides, for questions. So that's my plan. We'll see how well that goes. This is basically the process we're going to run through. So a little bit of the context. We're going to talk about the sort of the context of what has happened with the grid reform, what the evidence bits you're going to need are, what that process is that you go through for this specific grid readiness declaration process, and then those sort of final what comes next stages. So very briefly, why am I here talking to you about these things? So Locogen is a renewable energy consultancy. We've been supporting community groups in the delivery of renewable energy projects for 15 years. We've worked right across the UK, helping those projects, take them from sort of feasibility through that planning, implementation, and construction phases, and work with a whole bunch of potentially the groups that are on the call right now. This comes from, I suppose, the work that we've been doing to support not just community groups, but also commercial developers in taking their projects through these steps. Okay, right. So UK grid reform. What is it? Why are we talking about this? Why is it important right now? So the long and the short of it is the grid queue has been something that has been broken for quite some time. For a long time, what happened with the grid queue was that we had a first come, first serve basis. So if I turned up or you turned up and said you wanted to connect to a project, the national grid, the DNOs and the grid authority were required to say yes, and they would put you into a queue based on when you came and asked. And it's the first thing that everybody does with their projects is they would come along and they would ask. But it took no recollection of, no awareness of how ready a project was to connect. So we had lots of projects that were sitting in a queue that had asked for a connection but weren't ready to connect. We're a long way off. They hadn't got any of the other permissions in place, and some of those projects weren't going to progress at all. Just people didn't want to give up that space. So the whole process was becoming bloated with projects that weren't moving. And if we're going to meet our climate targets, we need projects that are ready to connect, that are then prioritized in that queue process. So that's what this is all about. It's about slimming down and reprioritizing that queue so that those projects that are ready to connect can connect, and those projects that are a little further behind get a realistic crack of when they're going to be able to connect to the grid. And this is all to do with then strategically aligning this grid queue. So we The government, as one of the changes it made, was it appointed an organisation called NESO, which is basically now the sort of guiding mind of the UK grid. And they looked to put in place some strategic alignment across all of these projects. And it's the first time we've had this where we've looked spatially, and I'll touch more about this in a minute. So who's affected by these changes? So it's not absolutely everybody that applies for a grid connection. It's everything that is at a level where it impacts on transmission level connections. So it's not projects that are connecting to the transmission network, those big pylons you can see on the picture there, but anything that has an impact on that transmission network. And in England, they've actually changed the rules so that the projects that it affects are now much larger, things over 5 megawatts. But in Scotland, because of the way the grid has been built out and the high penetration of renewables we already have, that transmission impact level is lower than it is in the rest of the country. In fact, quite significantly lower. So it means that there are much smaller projects that have to consider going their grid readiness and have to take part in this process. And that's basically 200 kilowatts for anything that is on the mainland and 50 kilowatts for anything on the islands. So far, far smaller than what I'm having to deal with on projects in England. So what we keep talking about is this Gate 2 submission process, which is what we're going to outline now. And this is what the Readiness Declaration refers to. So I'm going to try and explain some of these terms because it's a lot to get your head around. But the reason that this is important is that Gate 2 grid readiness process has said, in order to be able to reorder the queue, every project that has that transmission impact needs to submit the evidence to show where they're at. And if you don't, you risk losing your current position in the grid queue and basically going to the back of the queue while other projects that have provided that evidence come forward. So some projects are okay with that. Some of the organizations we're dealing with, their dates were very late. They don't need to submit anything. They're happy to wait. But anybody that was expecting, that had a grid date that was in the next few years and is looking to keep that or even accelerate it, you have to act. And if you don't, you will lose your place. So this is the very first time we've talked about spatial planning in the UK. We originally everything has just been sort of on an entirely sort of developer-driven basis. You know, we've said that we want renewables in the UK, and broadly it's been for people to go out and find where they want, find places they can put them, and then ask for those connections. But as the grid becomes more renewably focused, we don't need lots and lots of the same things in the same place. It needs a bit more diversity. So just very briefly to touch on this, to sort of give you a bit of the background. When NESO came in, they looked at what targets we needed to meet our Clean Power 2030 requirements and how much wind and solar and batteries and other technologies were coming into that mix, so they could see where we were currently at and what that gap was going to be overall. So firstly, so they could see how much renewable capacity was still to be built out. So they produced these kind of graphs showing that we still had, we're about halfway to what we need in terms of the onshore wind capacity and probably a third of the way towards having built out what we need in terms of solar. Then there's bits that are under construction, and then you've got the bits that aren't currently, they're somewhere in that planning or grid queue process. And they tried to line those up together to look at different scenarios to understand what they were going to need. So the first thing that came out of this was it turned out that we had so much storage capacity that people had asked for grid connections for. So the pink and the purple bits are grid connections that people have asked for. And the sort of the darker lines underneath them are the things that are actually built out. And the green ones are the scenarios. So you can see that for storage, we had so much more projects that have been asked for grid connections than we needed in terms of actual capacity to meet what they thought were going to be the demands. Whereas solar, potentially we need more solar than currently is in that process. Onshore wind, it's about, the kind of projects that are coming through are kind of about the right level, and it assumes that in both those cases, all of those are going to be built out. So this was the basis behind that kind of overview of where they were coming to. That's then been lots of clever people have been sitting around over the last few months trying to understand what that means on a specific level, because each distribution area, so you can see the sort of D1, D2, which is the north and the central Scotland, are the two distribution zones. So this is just for solar. So those little coloured bands show how far through each of those capacity bands for each of those locations we are for distribution level solar, or how far is predicted. So we've that little pink dot indicates how much the scenarios think we need in that particular area. The dark band is how much has actually been built out. So you'll see in the north of Scotland, actually very little of that predicted 2035 capacity has been built out. There's a reasonable swathe, about a third of it has already got planning permission to be built out. So they've got a reasonable certainty that those projects are going to come through. The orange is what's been submitted, and then that green is things that are applied for a grid connection but aren't actually sort of progressing through the process. So we don't know what's going to happen with those projects. And until they're actually built, you don't know whether they're really going to go through. So using tools like this, or sort of work that's been done by some of the specialist grid consultancies, they're looking at what that queue position really looks like to understand where the opportunities are and where those gaps really sit. But all this sits behind the understanding of what is needed and what is going to be prioritized in terms of this grid queue. So what does that mean in sort of practical terms? That's all the kind of high level strategy of what could occur with this grid reform. But on a sort of project by project basis, what we're looking at is what's going to happen to this to the grid queue in your particular distribution, your DNO area. So and this is what's called the Gate 2 to whole queue process, which is where basically all of those people that have applied for projects, they're all going to get stuck in a pot and shaken up and reordered, rejiggled in terms of how those projects are going to be connected, what the order in which they're going to be done. So what they've said they're going to do is, currently that little grey bar at the top says that's the current order of projects, and it's basically just in order of when different projects applied. But some of those projects have got planning, some of them have applied for planning, and some of them just have land agreements. So, and that's given up by the green, the orange, and the red in this sort of hypothetical scenario. And depending on when their dates are, some of those projects are expected to connect earlier than others. So what they want to do is to identify all the projects that have got that are basically contracted, that are in a good position to come forward, those with the green ones, and they have their before 2030 dates, and we've split everything into before 2030 and after 2030, what they call phase 1 and phase 2 of this process, and that's quite important if you're in a post 2030 phase. And they're going to try and pull forward some of those projects that have their planning but currently have dates that were beyond 2030, and bring them forward into that phase 1 band, because actually they're in a much better place to connect to the grid, because they're ready to connect, or much more likely to connect, and push back some of those projects that aren't so ready. And in this process, actually projects 12 and 14 fall off the back and go into the third bit beyond 2035. So I appreciate this is a sort of complicated concept, but just to give you an idea about what they're trying to do is it's just taking each project, assessing it on its merits, and trying to reorder the queue on that basis, so that by the end of this year we will have a new series of grid queue positions based on the evidence that's been submitted for your particular DNO, and also on that spatial planning point about what technologies we need in those areas. So prioritizing different technologies so they can come through. So hopefully that gives a bit more of the context about why we're going through this huge process. And I'm aware that in the 15 minutes we've been talking about this, I have used about 20 different acronyms. I'm not going to run through all of these. I've actually put them on the slides because even it drives me slightly nuts trying to keep track of the CMP435s and NESOs and TMO4 plus and all these different things. So they all refer to different parts of this process, and there's more slides with different terms. So I put them in here to try and help if you're getting confused by all this different terminology, to try and get some of the key things that we're using as part of this process as just a little glossary, so that you can refer back to it and go, right, okay, I see, right. And these are the people organizing it. They did this Clean Power 2030 plan. That's led to CMP435, which is the process we're going through, which is the gate to readiness. And that's what it all means, rather than going, people keep saying different things to me. My God, what are they talking about? Are there 7 different processes? And I was only worried about one of them. So no, they're all part of the same thing, but they all refer to very specific elements within it. And they've decided to just make their own language up to describe every single one of these things. Okay. Right. And does this apply to you? Apologies if you made it this far and then find out that it doesn't apply to you. But in order for this grid readiness, which is the thing that we're talking about here, that's submitting that evidence to find out if your grid queue position is going to be changed, there are certain key things. So you should have a project where you have received a grid offer. So some of you applied to the DNO for your grid offer, and they have before January 29th, 2025, and they have started a process of that transmission impact assessment coordination. So they've entered into that. You can't have energized already, or at least the bit you're applying for, and your connection date should be before 2035. Otherwise, you're basically in phase 3, and this doesn't really matter to you anyway. All of the people that this applies to should have been contacted by their DNO already. So one of the big giveaways for this is that the DNO should have already got in touch with you to say, please submit evidence. We've had a number of people come to us that have said, do we think this applies? And we've checked through, and all the people that hadn't received an email, this didn't actually apply to them. But if you believe that this does apply to you and you haven't been contacted, each one of the DNOs has an email that you can approach just to confirm with you if for some reason you've been missed off that list. And as we said, this only applies to projects that are that have that transmission impact assessment requirement. So 200 kilowatts for the mainland, 50 kilowatts on the island. And basically this also only applies if you want to progress your gate 2 offer. So you want to keep the grid connection date that you have currently got, or you want to accelerate it. And to do that, you need to meet the readiness criteria and meet one of the 4 strategic alignment criteria, and we will come back to that in a moment. Okay, so what is it you actually then need to do? So if you fall into this group of group of projects that you need to go through this process, and you've been sent stuff by your DNO, what are they actually asking for to come through? So there's a spreadsheet, this grid readiness declaration spreadsheet that they have released, and this handy 97-page manual that they've sent out with it that is very comprehensive, talking through every step that you need to fill in on that spreadsheet. And that spreadsheet, depending on which DNO you're in, is either a physical spreadsheet you've got to send back, or a portal that you need to go in, fill in with exactly the same questions attached to it. And that's split into 7 key stages, and we're going to talk through what those mean, because some of them are very quick, some of them are far more sort of intensive about the things that you need to do. But I put a link in here, so if you want to go and find the guidance document, if you want to go and review it, please do. There's a link there, you can follow that through to the spreadsheet that comes out from it as well. But that's the core part of what we are looking at here, is basically this evidence submission process. Okay, so part 1, general details. It's basically just the information about the project, the high-level stuff, name, address, grid coordination, grid coordinates, DNO reference number, and technology or technologies. The one thing that is relevant, probably the one thing that you do need to be aware of, which is relevant to the organizations here, is that they also ask for you to have a company registration number. It's one of the 3rd thing they ask for. as a community group, depending on how you are structured, chances are you probably don't have a company a registration number. So what needs to happen is you will need to get a letter of evidence signed by a director in your organization explaining why you don't have a company number. Not the end of the world. It's just an extra piece of supporting evidence you will have to pull together. We have been dealing with a couple of local authorities who, of course, don't have a director either. So we then have a second piece of evidence which you have to do, which is basically somebody from that organization then for nominating a person to act on their behalf as the director, who can then sign these things. So you might have to get 2 letters to submit alongside this process. So not the end of the world. They do allow for that process, but you have to be aware that there's this extra administrative chore that you're going to have to go through in order to sign off these bits. Right, then we start getting into the exciting things. They've decided to go straight in with the complicated questions, advancement and capacity reduction as part 2. So advancement is very kindly what they've done is they've offered or dangled the opportunity to accelerate your grid connection date. So you could be sitting there with a project that's currently got grid connection date of 2032. So you're currently sitting in the sort of phase 2 part of this process. Confusingly, phase 2 is also called gate 1. I don't know why they decided to go for phase 1 equals gate 2 and gate 1 equals phase 2. I didn't invent these things, I'm really sorry. But you have your 2032 grid connection date, but you actually have all the rest of your permissions, or you think you're very confident you're going to get the rest of your permissions in place, and you would like to ask to accelerate the date of your connection. Within this process, you are eligible to do that. So you can give the earliest date that you think you would be ready to connect. So you might actually think you've done your planning and you think you'd be ready to connect by 2028. So you can ask that. You have to ask for more than 1 year as an advancement. But there are risks and considerations you must be aware of by doing that. And the biggest one is that if you ask to advance between phases, so in this example from that 2032 and pull it forward to 2038, if they offer you an advancement, you have to accept it. Or if you reject it, you go back to the back of the queue. You do not return to your 2032 date. So and the main reason that organizations may not wish to accept it is that because your dates pull forward, you may be liable to security payments. So security payments are the payments you have to pay to keep that grid connection going, basically because they're having to do works on them. So you may have to pay security payments because the milestones for that may have then become due because the grid connection is now 4 years faster than it would have been. And at this stage, it's almost impossible to predict what those security payments would be in advance. So that's the risk with doing that. If you ask for an advancement within a phase, so you're going from 2029 to 2028, you do have the option to turn it off, to reject it. But this is something that's very, very absolutely essential to be aware of. So it's a great opportunity for projects that have the potential to be pulled forward, but it does come with this risk, and you have to be able to act on it should you be offered. The other thing is that there is, because this is technically deemed to be a modification to your grid application, there is a ModApp fee, and they have just set a blanket ModApp fee, which is 11,250 for requesting an advancement. And that is regardless of whether you are granted an acceleration or not. So anybody that applies for it will end up paying that £11,250 fee, and it is non-refundable. And you will pay it regardless of whether they are able to offer you an advancement or not. The fee is not incurred immediately. I'm still waiting to find out exactly the date that it will come liable. So again, that would be something that needs to be discussed, something that needs to be flagged with your projects, is that by making that request, you are going to incur a fee which you will need to pay in the probably not too distant future. Second thing you do is you can reduce the capacity. Probably less of a consideration for groups here, because one of the key things that it's focusing on is the removal of a technology. So a number of projects applied to be co-located sites, so both a photovoltaic and a battery site, for example, and for a variety of reasons. A lot to do with the availability of battery connections that we looked at right at the beginning, but also because the economics of those batteries aren't quite as good now as they might have been when the planning permission was put in. People put them in speculatively on the hope that they would make a good case for it. But a lot of organizations are now have this sort of consideration where they're looking at both a hybrid scheme with a PV and a battery, and they don't really want to keep the battery. It's easier just to get rid of it, so they can, within this process, reduce the capacity of a technology. So they can remove it, or if you thought that you had a single technology, so you had a wind project and you had 10 meg of connection that you'd applied for, and actually you're looking at it now going, well, if I could accelerate it, and but I only wanted to take forward 6 meg, because that's going to reduce my it's going to change the point of connection and reduce my costs, then you could request that as well. But you don't have the option to increase under this. Hello. Sorry, my children. So there's the potential you might incur cancellation charges if they've already started works associated with the larger connection capacity. And if you request quite a big change, you may end up with a different point of connection because they can connect you closer or at a lower voltage. So again, requires some careful consideration, but some options in there. Right, part 3 is all about Gate 2 readiness. And there are 2 elements to Gate 2 readiness. The most important part, the bit we're filling in and putting Gate 2, is this land rights or planning route. So you have to declare which of these routes you're going to go down in terms of demonstrating the readiness of the project to connect. Stage 5 is then looking at the strategic alignment so that you can look at how that project then meets those different requirements so that you can show which route to strategic alignment you're going to demonstrate. So in terms of the planning and land, when they first announced this process, we were really excited because everybody thought if they had planning permission that they were going to go down the planning route. It's not actually as simple as that, and it turns out that they're not really expecting very many organizations to demonstrate readiness via planning, because they have limited it quite significantly to either projects that have gained planning through the development consent order process or a compulsory purchase order. So actually, I'm currently not looking at any projects that will go through the planning route for confirming their readiness. And in fact, the document itself says we expect most projects to use the land process. So the land process, I'm sorry, there are lots more boxes associated with this one. So I put it in here again. This comes straight out of the guidance document, but it's a nice little flowchart to show what you need to consider in order to make this happen. So there are 3 key requirements you must have. You must meet the minimum acreage requirement for your technology. We'll come to that in a second. You've got to provide the original red line boundary, so a drawing showing the relevant area of the development, and you must have secured land rights. So you've either got to have an option agreement, you've got to own the land, or you've got to already be leasing the land. You have to do one of those 3 things. And within each of those, there are then set criteria that you must conform with. So if you've got an option on the land, so it's quite likely for a lot of the developers, they've gone for an option because they haven't yet signed the lease. The lease is subject to this option, the project being progressed. They have to have at least 3 years of validity on that option agreement. If you own the land, that's a lot simpler because you own the land. If you've already got a lease agreement in it, it must have a minimum of 20 years, or you must be able to demonstrate that the project doesn't need more than 20 years because of the specific technology that you're looking at. But again, that's quite a specific use case. If you're going for the option agreement, you need to also be able to show that the lease that will come into force after the option agreement is put in place still has 20 years on it. So those are the key requirements to go down that land route. If you can generate the three things at the top, and then you've either got your options, you own the land, or you've got the lease agreement, you should be eligible for the land route to demonstrate readiness. And I would expect most projects should be able to demonstrate that. You just need to check the specifics of the options or the lease agreement to make sure that you can put that in place. In order to show how this works, they have given some very clear guidance about what they want in terms of the original red line boundary, and they've been very specific about it. They need it in a very, very specific format, down to telling you how many decimal points they need each of these bits of information provided in. So basically, it's the developable area of the project, as per the grid connection agreement, and you will need to draw that out in a way that you can calculate both what the acreage of the site is and provide those grid coordinates in latitude and longitude of the sort of four most extreme compass points of the site. So you can say what the technology is, and you can then use that information to be able to demonstrate that you have the minimum acreage of land density, which is a number they've come up with. The PV one is reasonably logical. They're expecting you to have more than 1.1 acres per megawatt. The wind one is quite nuts because they expect you to have 7.68 acres per megawatt, which implies that a 2 megawatt wind turbine needs twice as much land as a 1 megawatt wind turbine, and a 5 megawatt wind turbine needs 5 times as much land as a megawatt wind turbine, which doesn't make any sensible sense, but I can't explain why they've done that. If for some reason your red line boundary did not meet those requirements, you will need to submit an additional piece of evidence that explains why that is the case. They do have a process for doing that. So, but it's broadly to stop organizations from putting in sort of declaring out processes for projects where they just haven't secured enough land and they're trying to keep these sort of huge grid connections. So as long as you can demonstrate that you've thought this through, we believe you should be okay. But if that is an issue, I imagine there's going to be much more with wind than PV, then that's something we need to flag and discuss pretty quickly. Okay, the director declaration, I think as we said, basically you just need somebody that can sign it, and then you need to have somebody who is authorized to sign it if you don't. So you just need that sort of side letter that's produced if you don't have an appointed director. Then we move on to the strategic alignment. They've come up with 4 different mechanisms for demonstrating strategic alignment. The top 2 are the ones that are really important. The other 2 I think are not use cases that we're really going to have to deal with very much. But either your project is eligible for protection, and protection was set up as a system so that projects that are significantly progressed don't have to stop, because one of the risks with this process is if they're sort of thrown everything up in the air, then some of the projects that are currently cracking on with getting things procured and getting things built might stall because of the uncertainty about this. So what they've said is that if you have a connection agreement that is that has a date before the end of 2026, in fact they extended that to 2027, then your project should be protected under this process. So you would fill in this grid declaration, and you would tick that you are applying under the eligible protections for a significantly progressed project. All the projects outside of that, they are pretty much all of them. They're expecting to go through the alignment to the capacities within CP 2030. So that's broadly what we're expecting, that either you're a progress project and you'll go through route A, or you're a not progress project, or you don't have that grid connection date within those boundaries, and you're going to have to go through line B. again, C and D are for very specific use cases. Refer back if that you think one of those applies to you. Again, long, complicated flowcharts, but they have laid out what you need to do to demonstrate whether you're a type A or a protection A, an eligible A or an eligible B project. If you're eligible A, you need to have protection 1, which is a series of documents you need to produce to show that you've hit certain milestones and that you are, as it says, significantly progressed. So there are a lot of milestones in here, which I've tried to pull out because they hide them away in the documents. But the ones they're really, really keen on are milestone 1, which is that you have initiated planning. Basically, you have applied for planning. And milestone 7, which is project commitment. So you can evidence that you have basically that you have made that financial investment decision. So you have, if you can prove M1 and N7, then you are basically in that sort of significantly advanced project combined with your grid connection date before 2027. The other ones are sort of help in the support of that, but those are the really, really key ones reading through that guidance. They also ask for part 6, which is additional data. They put this in as optional, and it's more to do with projects that are then applying under strategic alignment B, C, or D. So you're demonstrating how your project then meets those strategic alignment criteria. So have you applied for planning? So if you are you remember back at the very beginning when we were looking at the little colored boxes that were being moved around, one of the key things was projects that were that met strategic alignment, but were sort of further back in the queue. Having applied for planning was one of those key criteria. So under section 6, the additional data, that's where you're putting in your evidence to show that you've met that M1 milestone, you've submitted planning. There are a couple other things in there to do with batteries, to do with long duration storage, which they treat slightly differently, and also BESS projects that are they're not importing energy, so they are, and that's really sort of arbitrage style battery projects, which again they treat differently. Again, not sure how relevant either of those things are going to be, but that strategic alignment for whether the fact that you have submitted planning is one that is quite key. And then the last bit is part 7, which is an opt-in, opt-out for the publishing of data. So off the back of this process, they're going to produce a register, but not every organization might choose to be part of that register. So there is an option to opt out of that. For the sake of everybody trying to understand what's going on, I would suggest, unless you have a particular commercial reason for opting out, that you probably should keep the data in, just because it makes that database more useful. But unfortunately, because they've chosen to make it optional, there are going to be holes, which is going to be really frustrating for all those people trying to interpret and understand. Okay, then the last bit then is what the process is. As always happens, nothing is the same between two organizations. So SSEN, which is basically everything in the north and the islands, has a portal that they have put up. And what will happen is if you are eligible to complete this process, they should have emailed you a link to register with their portal so that you can upload the information onto it. So you'll have to set up an account and all those bits, but you broadly should have it at the minute, and it's how you should be tracking the information for your grid application anyway. SPEN have decided to go to a different system where they've set up a mailbox, and you email them the evidence along with the grid declaration spreadsheet. So again, just different ways of filling in the same thing. They've just decided to make it entirely different for their own personal reasons. They haven't said that you need to, well, basically what they've said is that you need to do this as quickly as possible. When they first announced it, there wasn't actually a deadline, but what appears to be the deadline coming through is the 29th of July. That's now been said by a number of the DNOs, and in fact, NISO came out a couple of days ago saying that they were expecting that to be the end of the process. So, as an absolute sort of backstop, I forget which one of them haven't. I don't think SSEN have actually said that, but if NISO have said it, that's the date we should be working to. So that's it's a reasonable period of time, 6-7 weeks to get this information together and submitted. The general agreement is that seems to be that if you can get evidence submitted to the DNO quickly, that they will, if there are minor tweaks, minor alterations or queries that they have, that then gives them time to come back and raise any questions. But there will not be a process of significant modifications to these applications. And this is a one-hit process. You get one chance to apply for this, and they are under no obligation to come back and ask you anything. So you put that information in, and conform with all the things they've asked, and they will then assess it, and you will then find out what happens with your grid queue after that. So after that, the grid process will all be sort of realigned, and there will then open another window in 6 months' time to then looking at sort of reviewing all the projects that came in after that. That bit of that process is still kind of a little bit fuzzy, because everybody's focused on getting this first round through. But the expectation is that it will then go into a sort of process of windows, where grid applications will then be reassessed depending on how those projects have sort of dropped in and out, because there are with the later projects, and they're just coming out with a series of consultations on what are going to have to do for projects to hit milestones. So, for example, projects that don't have planning but have their land rights, what's going to happen with trying to enforce them progressing through that process. And in fact, I was going through some stuff today, which was looking at some quite onerous requirements they might be putting in place in terms of the DNO chasing up planning requirements, as in giving you quite short periods of time to have submitted planning after you get your Gate 2 offer or Gate 1 offer. So what happens to the projects that come after this that are further back in the queue? I imagine we'll be having another chat about that in the fullness of time. Right. That took 5 minutes longer than I was expecting, so my apologies. There was a lot to cover. I hope that made some semblance of sense, and I was able to distill what has been 6 months of madness into 45 minutes. Right, really Iona, how would we like to do questions?
So there's Emmy Martin said, I think it's worthwhile noting that some islands have a 200 kilowatt limit, as it's to do with the location of the GSP. Is that the grid supply point? If GSP is on the mainland, then the island has a 200 kilowatt limit. Would you agree with that?
I didn't know that, so thank you very much.
Okay,
right, okay.
Thank you, Emmy. Neil McKinnon, I think you've answered this in the presentation, but his question is, does the Gate 2 to whole queue process slide imply that planning permission is prioritised above land rights when the dust settles, i.e. projects 6, 12 and 14 in red do not have planning permission? So that was one of your earlier slides. So it was about, is planning permission prioritised above land rights, but it was actually the other way around, wasn't it?
No, it is. So the minimum level of requirement to enter into this process is that you had a grid connection and you have land rights. If you have planning permission, then your project would be treated more highly in terms of the reordering of the queue than a project that just has land rights, because you are more significantly progressed. You've actually gone to the effort of putting in planning, and that planning permission has been received. So if there are two projects right next to each other, one that had planning and one that didn't, but you both had a grid connection date, let's say you both had the same grid connection date for whatever reason, the one with planning would be accelerated and would receive, what would potentially be accelerated over the one that didn't have planning.
And then Neil asked another question about, and I'm just going to go through these, but if anyone wants to interject because I've missed something, just please maybe put your hand up. But another question from Neil is, how does advancement relate to grid capacity? For example, could a project currently to be constrained through active network management go through the MODAP process to achieve a firm offer?
That's an amazing question. Right. I would need to go away and get some better advice on that, because I don't know is the honest answer, because A&M is not something that is strictly covered under this process.
I think that's a fair response.
But
Neil,
Neil, happy to chase that up sort of as a follow-up thing.
Yeah. Thanks, David. There's no other questions in the chat just now. I don't know if anyone.
Okay, what I'll do is I'll just stop the recording now, and then if there are any other questions that people want, then they can follow up just after that. So